Seconds left. Hostiles closing in. Just one hope. The HMG. One of the most well-known, but also much maligned conventions of the FPS genre is the turret section. There you are, running around blasting enemies, circle strafing, rocket jumping, enjoying all the benefits of a 3D game world, when suddenly the game stops, hands you a fixed perspective on a slowly moving screen, and tells you to let rip with a 50 caliber machine gun for a few minutes. What was supposed to be an exhilarating bullet storm, more often than not turns into a snorefest. Turret sections are a staple of the FPS genre, so this video aims to ask and answer the question of why they are so hated, and maybe what could be done to fix them. Before we start, let's talk about what I mean when I say turret section. A turret section is a level or a sub-level or even just a part of a gameplay segment where the player is put in control of a gun emplacement, and then they must mostly use that emplacement to progress the level, either by defeating enough enemies or surviving an on-rail segment while they move from one place to another. So, let's start with a little history. The modern shooter genre wasn't always populated with games of free movement in a 3D space. The premise was simple. Here's a gun, shoot the screen. Point and shoot. While the first one, the Seeburg Rayomatic, came out in 1936, when people think of light gun games, I think they tend to think of games like Time Crisis, and they definitely think of arcades. The turret section in a modern FPS is in a way like the appendix of a human. Once upon a time, this type of fixed, on-rail gun gameplay was necessitated by the technology of the day, but as the years have gone on, it has become far more vestigial. For example, finding out that Time Crisis 5 came out in 2015, that sends me into an existential panic. Turret sections were a lot more common in FPS games the further back you go in history, which is why the 30 to 40 something age bracket of gamers today remember them being so prolific, although they certainly still are. In the same way that Wolfenstein 3D still had a score counter for your points, I believe that the turret section emerged into gaming as a vestigial remnant of an earlier type of light gun genre that had become prolific before FPS games as we knew them existed. Before, of course, free movement and weapon selection became the norm rather than the exception. So, with the history out of the way, I think it's important to talk about why people don't like turret sections all that much. I think it comes down to a couple of reasons. A noticeable issue is, of course, that the turret section breaks or discards most, if not all, of the systems used in the game thus far. Does your game have advanced mobility mechanics? Well, tough cookies. You will stay bolted to this machine gun. What about a variety of gun types with different specializations and use cases? Oh, sucks to be you. You'll take this one machine gun that looks like a Browning 50 cal and you'll like it. So, after developing the game and its systems, the turret section then throws out these established norms to replace them with something that usually doesn't matter. Your performance as the turret gunner in that section doesn't usually have a bearing on the rest of the game, outside of course the next time you'll have to do it. Whereas in normal gameplay, if you are expending ammo, health kits, so on and so forth, you will be able to evaluate yourself based on your performance. If you're saving more ammo, scoring more headshots, saving more health, it will have a benefit to you later on, versus the turret section where you start with basically infinite ammo and you end with infinite ammo and you either die or live. I think it's kind of unfair to the player, but it also of course has another side effect. Namely, the turret sections are not fun. Sure, a turret section is supposed to be a thrill ride, as the player blasts away with usually limitless ammo at enemies that will invariably throw themselves at the player like lemmings off a cliff. But there are some issues. Because the turret section strips away mechanical and gameplay elements, it reduces the player to a purely static gun, and that makes them incredibly vulnerable because they can't move, or they can't move a lot. In regular gameplay, you can take cover, run, hide from enemies, launch ambushes, engage in all sorts of shenanigans that you can do with a 3D environment. The battle between you and your foe in the turret section, however, is much more static. It's really a game of kill or be killed. Kill first, or be killed later. The turret on rails is the most egregious version, because you're only going to go one way, and it's the way the game wants you to go. you are yanked away from the more sandbox-like shooting arena and you go straight up into a shooting gallery. And of course, the consequence is that you have to deal with the enemies quickly. If you let the enemies accumulate on the screen, you will be mobbed and killed, because they will simply do more damage to you than you can do to them. You can't dodge, you can't take a different route. So your only recourse is to kill them before they can kill you, ideally faster than they can kill you. And this is especially problematic for a first experience, because you won't know necessarily where the enemies are going to come from. All it takes is one enemy getting the drop on you in an area that you didn't think to survey or sweep with the machine gun, and you could be dead, forcing the player to do it all over again. And therefore, losing pacing, which I'll talk about in a moment, and of course, increasing frustration. The more a player has to do something, the more frustrated they're going to be when they can't quite get it right, especially in FPS games, where players are generally speaking used to moving at quite a consistent pace forward through the enemies. So the last problem, I think, with turret sections is they have a huge problem with killing pacing. In standard FPS combat, you're generally guided by the progress in terms of the game by the amount of enemies that get thrown at you. You're, of course, moving through physical spaces. Certainly in very early FPS games, like Wolfenstein 3D, you can kill all the enemies on a level and still have to navigate it to look for keys and so on and so forth to progress to the stage. However, in modern FPS games, you tend to be drip-fed a number of enemies as you progress throughout the level. And so when you start to run out of enemies, you start to move towards the end of the level. And a turret section can, of course, interrupt a lot of momentum, because you might go from a situation where you're relatively handily dealing with a bunch of enemies and preserving some ammunition to a situation where you're now given complete freedom of ammunition, avoiding all other concerns, as if somehow this one machine gun magically has more ammunition than you were ever able to carry previously. And then you're just off. Once you're finished with that segment, it just finishes, and the consequences don't necessarily transfer in many cases forward. Of course, you can end a turret section on low health, and that can be a problem. That can probably be more of a frustration, because you might have to restart the segment to try to do it better, and forcing a player to repeat gameplay in that kind of way can be very bad for their sense of pacing, for their experience of the story, so on and so forth. Another issue is, of course, if the turret section is on rails, is that, generally speaking, a player can navigate the environment on foot at the speed that they want to. There are some players who will speedrun and just go right through, but there are other players who might take some time to slow down, and especially in games that are maybe more horror FPS, immerse themselves in the environment. Whereas an on-rail segment is too frantic and too high stakes for them to really slow down and appreciate the scenery that they're blasting through. So there are a lot of problems with turret sections, as I've mentioned. And of course, one impulse, I think, might be to try to tweak them in terms of the balance. So you might try to make the enemies a lot more obvious, minimize the chances that they'll be missed during the sequence, maybe make them weaker, easier to kill. But if you make it too easy, then all of the interest and challenge goes out of the window, and players will find this more tedious, more time-wasting than any other part of the game. A player needs to be on a point in the difficulty curve that is suitable to where they are in the story, in the narrative, in the overall progression of the game, in order to find it enjoyable. If the turret section is too hard, oftentimes, because it's balanced very poorly around the player's reactions and ability to anticipate enemies, then they will become frustrated, they will have to consistently repeat segments, try to memorize patterns of the enemy to predict where they're going to be before they're there. And that can also, of course, be very harmful to players. The fact that it's so hard to balance a turret section, to get that perfect sweet spot where it's interesting enough to play through, but not so difficult that you have to keep playing it, is probably one of the reasons why I think a lot of people think, gamers especially, think that turret sections are the developers being quote-unquote lazy. For the record, I don't really think that developers are lazy in that type of way. Making a turret section is, of course, not easy, but I do think that there are other concerns under the hood that might incline them towards that type of design. So, with all that being said, I do like turret sections. Now, before I am burned at the stake, since YouTube removed the dislike button, hear me out. Sure, I think part of the reason why turret sections are put into video games is as a product of the transition from arcade games to home gaming. It's a legacy that we've not managed to get rid of in the same way that we've not managed to get rid of using R to push the reload button. But I also think that turret sections do serve a purpose in the game, and I would like to explain my reasoning. So, firstly, generally turret sections will come into two flavors. There's the get on the gun and hold the enemy back type, and then there's the get on the gun and blast them while an NPC drives type. In either case, the turret section is being used to delineate a transition either of space or of time, but a transition nevertheless. In the context of a story, the turret section is the moment the hero is moving from one place to the next, from a position of relative safety to relative danger, or from location A to location B. And you could tell that with a cutscene, or a time skip, or any number of other automated, non-interactive methods of storytelling. But instead, the turret section gives you something to do. It gives you a way to engage with the game while you are ostensibly moving from one position to the other. It's not necessarily the point that you remember the hallway that you're blasting down while you're on rails shooting at some enemies. That's not really the point. The point is that you're moving from one interesting location to the other interesting location, and you could handle that with a loading screen, but you could also get rid of that and give the player something to do. In the context of the story, the turret section is the moment the hero is moving from place to place, and you could tell that with a cutscene, but instead, the turret section gives the player something to do, to engage with, while that transition is happening. Many games will use a obnoxiously long elevator ride to mask the loading screen from one area to the next, and generally speaking, you can't do anything while the elevator is moving. A turret section, on the other hand, if handled well, allows you to have that loading happen in preparation for the level that's coming up, but you still have the player do something. You still are engaging the player, you're still engaging them in the gameplay. Not necessarily the exact same type of gameplay, obviously, because turret sections are, generally speaking, a distillation of the FPS formula, but still you're getting them to do something, which is engaging them and moving them still in transition to something else. There's an example from a franchise which I'm quite fond of, Halo. Specifically, let's talk about Halo Reach. That franchise is full of turret sections. It's full of lots of different things, many things that actually establish some of the genre conventions of FPS games to this day. But specifically from Halo 3, they use the turret sections to transit the player to a new zone. It's not the kind of thing where you're meant to watch Noble Team walk on their way from one location to the next, but it's a quick shooting section. You get into the action, you organically progress the story, you give the player something to do instead of just watching a cutscene, and more importantly, you prepare them for the stakes of the fight, because you show them what the Covenant forces are going to look like, you give them a taste of the action, and then you transition them to something, of course, which is more serious when they're on foot. The turret section is not hugely impactful. Certainly you're not going to define the game around it, but it definitely enhances the feeling that you might have when you're moving from one level to the next. And in a way, of course, I like turret sections because they are that change of pace. They are a brief type of gameplay shift before you can get back to the main action. You might argue, of course, that the turret section is unnecessary, that you could show a short cutscene and maybe spend more of that time designing a fun level. Certainly, I will grant a lot of merit to that argument. I feel like a lot of stuff that happens in gameplay development nowadays is definitely designed to take away from designing fun levels and to do other things, microtransactions. And I think that is certainly a valid argument. But I also think that in the context that I've described, the turret section can be useful to enhance the gameplay experience. It can, of course, be a palate cleanser for the rest of the content that you want to show. Of course, there are plenty of bad ones too, and for me that highlights a point. I don't think turret sections are inherently bad. After all, the light gun genre, which is incredibly fun, fundamentally is building up on the turret section as a core gameplay loop. But I do think that it reveals that you can't use turret sections without any care or consideration. Yes, they are a palate cleanser. Yes, a palate cleanser before the next course in a meal is generally a good idea. However, it's bad if the palate cleanser puts you off continuing to eat, which is what I find a lot of turret sections actually end up doing. They end up killing enthusiasm for continuing to play. A good turret section therefore needs a lot of mechanical thought behind it. It has to be more well considered than just, I'm going to put one here because there's a break in the story and we can just put one here, instead of coming up with a real good, interesting scenario for them to traverse through via the turret section. Halo is another good point to bring up here because I feel like they use their turret sections really well, and they also have a bunch of other tricks. You can check out the Patreon-only bonus episode that is a companion to this piece, which is, of course, at the Patreon, link in the description, and you can find out more of my thoughts about that section there. But of course, simply putting the player on a big gun and asking them to blast away for 10 minutes as a wave of enemies run up to die to them is not going to cut it. So let's talk about one way I think that you could definitely fix some of the turret section elements if we're going to go with more traditional styles of design. So a good example of this, I think, is Metro 2033. You have core FPS gameplay that is built around bullet scrounging. That the idea that you need to be very careful with your bullets because not only are they your only real method of killing enemies, but they're also a currency, and so the more you shoot, the less money you'll have to spend, and you have to balance those things out. And of course, Metro is an older style FPS, so invariably it has a turret section, one quite memorably where you're literally on rails defending a rail car from enemies. However, unlike most examples, the player can get off the turret, right? You don't remain fixed to it as you would in certain other games. And I think this is interesting because there is a stake involved in this that is maybe not immediately obvious, and that is the enemies can get too close. If you aren't good enough on the turret section, the enemies will get too close and you'll be forced to get off the turret and shoot them with your conventional ammo, expending your actual valuable ammo that is limited versus the non-valuable ammo on the turret section, which is unlimited. So there is a penalty for doing badly on the turret section that will stick with you. The worse you do on it, the more enemies you'll have to fight as they get close to you. And of course, the more ammunition you'll have to expend that you can't easily replace. But of course, you also have freedom. You have agency to decide when to get off the gun and try to do something versus being bolted in place, desperately trying to spin the mouse around to get the turret onto the enemy because you couldn't move maybe in another game. And you still are engaging with the core FPS mechanics, you're just engaging with them in a very different way. Okay, I'll admit it. Part of my love for the turret section idea is probably due to nostalgia that I have for the light gun genre. Despite being incredibly similar, I think the reason I still have fond memories of light gun games is because they were designed intentionally around the idea that the player is a fixed perspective shooter on rails, and they provide every accommodation for that. In Time Crisis, you have a trusty pedal that you can push to duck an attack. Not only does it make you feel like you're actually having a gunfight, it also mitigates the feeling that you're stuck to the piece of wall for the majority of the level. You have a game that designs for the player's limited movement, and it accounts for it in basically the turret section that you're playing. I certainly think that it would help reduce complaints about lazy developers if more consideration was spent on designing mechanics that enable the player to still feel as if they're reactive and not just glued in place. I think one of the worst examples of a turret section that comes to mind, and one that really exemplifies some of the problems that I've discussed in this essay, is the end of Fear 2. So at the end of Fear 2, after battling the Armorchem Corporation, that are legions of clone soldiers and all manner of paranormal nonsense, almost the very final part of that game sees the hero not engaging with a fast-paced and interesting gunfight in an interesting, complicated environment, like most of the Fear series, but you are manning a machine gun on an APC while hordes of clones run at you. And the section is pretty hard, too. There are plenty of times that I died while playing, because a soldier would pop up from a location that I could not cover because I didn't think they were going to be there, or because I couldn't move the gun fast enough to stop them. And eventually I had to resort to trying to memorize the placements of enemy spawns, so I could gun them down quickly enough to stop myself from dying from the horde of enemies. And I think that it pretty much killed all of the pacing. By the time that I was done with the segment, I was very unengaged with the rest of the story. At that point, we were reaching the crescendo of Fear 2, which is quite an enjoyable game. Not as good as Fear 1, but what else is? It killed all the pacing of the story up until that point, and felt like quite a sour note to end an otherwise enjoyable player experience. This is what I think people think of when it comes to turret sections, but it doesn't have to be this way. Maybe there was a time when the turret section wasn't ever as good or as important as I remember it being. I don't think that every part of the FPS formula needs to stay the same, certainly, but I do think that we have become railroaded into believing that turret sections are inherently bad, when they're just another part of the shooter's toolbox, and a part that when used well, really enhances the player experience. Thank you everyone for listening to this video essay. I hope you enjoyed it. As mentioned, there is a bonus component to this episode that is on Patreon. You can subscribe. Feel free. I would like to thank all of our patrons. Their names should be flashing up on the screen right now. Thanks to all of these guys for helping to make this endeavor actually function. All of our socials are in the description below. You can check out some more bite marks on the channel. More content is always to come. Take care and goodbye.